Okay. Hi everyone. So my name is Bea. In case you don't know me, I guess I've been in competitive debate for a couple of years. I've participated both in UADC, in previous iterations of UADC, as well as the uh Asian, or rather the British parliamentary equivalent for Asian regionals, which is ABP. I've been invited to provide a lecture on assessing debates. I do think this lecture is primarily catered towards judges, and I guess the examples that I will be giving are those particularly specific to British parliamentary debate, but I do think some explanations specifically on how I think we should be evaluating what is a complete argument, or different ways, for example, that we can merit teams that make an effort to go above what is the bare minimum expected of them when they prove arguments, I think would also be a fruitful discussion, or a fruitful uh, cover coverage of information for debaters or speakers. So I guess it's relevant to everyone involved. Okay. I just want to start by saying, why did I make this lecture? So ideally, when you're a judge and you go to a tournament, you go through the judge briefing and you're expected to read the judge manual. And ideally, when we're given that briefing and we're given that manual, it's as if it's like a Bible or a guide on what we can and cannot do as judges, or what we should and should not know when it comes to adopting the role of a judge in a debate. Because obviously, as what I think most of us know, we can come into rounds, and obviously we can know things, we can be subject matter experts on things outside of the debate. But the moment we become a judge, we're not expected to leverage that specialized knowledge. But the reality, as I will explain later, is that sometimes there are situations where we are unable or cannot abide by those rules perfectly in the way that the judge manual imagines that we would. That we would all adopt the same amount of information, the same amount of surface level broad information about every country and every social issue in the world, such that we would be, I guess, not tabula rasa, or not dumb enough to be unable to judge certain debates about many worldwide social, political, economic issues and current events. But at the same time, would not be so specialized to the point that we would scrutinize teams for having more or less information about a certain topic. And so a lot of deficits in judging come from these situations, from judges that are expected to be impartial and not know a lot about the world, but know enough to know that certain countries are in certain regions, or certain political issues are happening in certain national governments, but at the same time are confronted with speakers that obviously have a wide array of material, have almanacs and all this information, can spew that information freely. And obviously we come into situations where those raw facts are not completely engaged with in the way that the manual expects us to engage with, and therefore that's where a lot of judges run into issues. Or for example, in issues on in terms of explaining why they do or don't believe an argument, it's one thing to say that I don't find it to be persuasive, but the process of deconstructing what we don't specifically find to be persuasive is lost, or sorry, rather is comes as a struggle to some judges, especially when they're starting. And so it affects the ability for them to be precise in their oral adjudications, which obviously is not only is it not good for the judge, it's also not fair to the debaters who take a lot of time to craft their arguments and craft their analysis, and expect the same level of, I guess, precision and attention to detail from their judges. So I want to talk about this in a couple of parts. Um, Number one, I think the first thing I want to talk about is truth in terms of evaluating claims. So if you review section 2.2 of the WUDC judging manual, called the Ordinary Intelligent Voter, and I believe this is page 16, there are a couple of things we're expected to know and hold true when we judge. An example is, quote, we need sort of knowledge from someone who regularly reads but does not memorize headlines. Or, for example, another quote is, we read the front pages and the world section of a major international newspaper like the New Yorker or the Economist, or the New York Times or the Economist. But at the same time, we're not expected to utilize or read rather specialized literature and know the contents of that specialized literature. Because of all of this, understandably, while the manual expects us to adopt this role and have this specific roster of information, it falls in actual debates and doing actual deliberations because, we are imperfect humans. For example, the parameters of what someone is expected to read in reality are very, very vast. There are plenty of countries, each having their own social, political, and economic issues. And realistically, the vast majority of people in competitive debate will not even know everything at a surface level. And so the ability to, point out a specific fact that someone is saying about like XYZ country or XYZ social issue might not be the case for all judges. But number two, because of this, there will be cases where you don't know what the speaker is talking about. And while ideally you should as the judge, that's besides the point. The reality is that sometimes you won't. And especially now when we're trying to evolve and expand the topics that debaters are willing to talk about in terms of, political lines, challenging political echo chambers, or covering countries and regions that historically were not commonly covered in competitive debate or in global Asian parliamentary competitive debate, you will run into those issues where most judges won't be able to have the bare minimum information or the quote unquote headlines information because it might not even have made the headlines yet. But the manual additionally, technically, implies that you cannot step in to correct the facts opposing bench, rather to correct the facts that the opposing bench, or rather, unless the opposing bench challenges that fact. So the first two things I said demonstrate that sometimes you might not even know what is the truth. But similarly, the third point demonstrates that sometimes the opposing bench doesn't even know the truth either. So if you as the judge are relying upon the opposing bench to call out, let's say, Gov, and say that's not true because this is the complete truth, sometimes they might not even be able to do that. We rely on speakers to allow us to discredit incorrect material, but for the same reasons that I've just mentioned prior, the speakers might not be able to do that or do it successfully. So in these cases, we can explore the following alternatives. Number one is to treat information as claims and materials where rules on responses apply. So, for example, if a speaker makes claim A that is maybe not true or at least stretches the truth a little, we can evaluate based on one, if the opposing bench responds to it successfully, meaning they say it's not either A, they provide a counterclaim, which is claim B. So they say claim A is not true because the truth is claim B. Or they proceed to structurally explain why the claim is untrue without necessarily providing the actual truth, right? Or two, we can also, we can evaluate if the speaker plausibly proved claim A. So that they structurally explain that claim A is true, meaning regardless of whether or not it is false, and then the opposing bench proceeds to explain that it's false, it is still plausibly proved to be somewhat true. This is where parts of the manual that say you are allowed to know some things about the world come in handy because the manual technically allows you to approximate what can be true for as long as speakers in the debate reasonably explain it. And granted, again, this assumes that the opposing bench or the team on the other side doesn't respond to it successfully. I will admit, though, that this is an unfavorable option because technically it sounds like we are rewarding those who stretch the truth and punish those who don't know anything and choose to, not also engage in the practice of stretching the truth or, in worst cases, lying. Therefore, my second view is that when this happens, I advise judges to turn to other parts of the debate which are more grounded on explanation, structural reasons, as opposed to raw facts. Now, I understand there are very fringe cases where judges, or rather debates, almost always are based on assertions, are almost always based on raw facts, if you can even call them facts, or just assertions of what is asserted to be a fact. But in the vast majority of debates, people will make an effort to explain why something is true. They will try to cling on logic and trying to bridge the gap between the cause and effect relationship. And in cases where it is becoming very difficult to adjudicate the debate on the basis of those reasons, we try to cling to those cause and reflect relationships, those logical relationships. So often, at least personally in my own judging practice, back when I used to judge competitively, I would merit debaters who would provide explanations rather than raw facts. But obviously, you might ask yourself, number one, what do we credit to be quote unquote an explanation? And number two, are all explanations the same? So meaning if someone explains it in this specific way, do I value it to be just as um valuable as an explanation that is executed in this specific way? Should I just be measuring it by the amount of explanations a certain speaker gives? Not necessarily. I think there are different types of explanations that would be important. So, for example, an explanation of what drove a raw fact to happen would be important. In fact, this is also explained in the analysis portion of the judge manual. Or, for example, two, what will drive the fact to remain true for the period of time relevant to debate, or if the debate is supposedly indefinite, the indefinite time in the future after a policy is implemented, after we support a certain thing, or if, well, rather if we continue to support or oppose a specific type of thing, etc. So, for example, in the motion, this House opposes the premium put on patients, we can provide something that is factual or a subjective observation that can be claimed as a fact or a truth about life, which is that, quote, women are socially pressured by the patriarchy to be patient, but we can also provide reasons for why this is the case. So, i.e., social roles often require and inspire patience, making women more disproportionately likely to be patient. Or, for example, we can also provide reasons why this will continue to be the case in the long term. So, again, demonstrating or qualitatively demonstrating why the truth will continue to be the truth, or why the claim will continue to be so, such that it is relevant within the time period of the debate. Of course, you might ask, but Bea, sometimes, both teams make claims and they don't explain these claims. Number one, you want to evaluate based on how it is explained. Is it explained and founded upon other assertions? So it's just like a nested form of assertions? Or is it explained by exploring cause and effect relationships? So, for example, going back to the discussion of this House opposes the premium put on patients, who are the actors that are imposing that we should be patient? What are the institutions, the organizations, the groups, individuals that are telling us or inciting this premium on us that we should be patient people? Do these people have the capacity to continue to exert that influence? Do these people have the incentive to continue to exert that influence? If yes or no, then that affects the explanation. Or, for example, not just on the force end, on the receiving end of that force. For the people that are expected to be patient, who is more expected to be patient, who is less expected to be patient, depending on factors like culture, age, gender, nationality, and what options do they have to insulate themselves from that social pressure? Are they present? Are they not present? That also affects the argument, right? So, exploring what it would mean or what it would look like when something like that happens, when there's a force telling you that you should feel a certain way, and then you on the end of the receiving force, you are evaluating whether or not you will buy into the social norm. That can be explained. That is part of the explanation. That is part of what we expect teams to explain, or at least in the context of this specific motion. That's an example of how we should be evaluating what we expect from teams when they explain things. Next part is on interpreting section 2.2.3, judging as the ordinary intelligent voter. So standards and examples, or rather this portion of the manual demonstrates standards and examples that seem to be clear, i.e., be aware of basic facts, such as Syria is in the Middle East, or, quote, be familiar with issues and events that have made international headlines for a sustained period of time. But again, similar to the reasons I stated prior in the first part of this lecture, some of these examples and standards may put judges in a bind. because some debate topics have not fell into international headlines for sustained periods of time, for more quote unquote basic and intuitive things that may just be a product of the political or social political echo chamber that we are in debate, or that you as the judge are in as a result of your own background and lived experiences and political beliefs and ideologies. And so there may be claims or frames that have a lower barrier to prove that the claim is true. And therefore, there is an element of subjectivity to what will be easily credited versus what requires more explanation. And I understand that, again, when you are a judge, you are expected to be um, nonpartisan, not have any predisposed beliefs. But that is a completely different discussion, because from what you personally, intuitively, in a subjective, irrational manner, find to be easy to believe, intuitive to believe, versus what you would, spend a lot more time wrapping your head around or understanding, right? You, as a result of your upbringing and your political views, might be biased against arguments that adopt a political view that is different from what you are used to. So, for example, if you come from a more liberal background or progressive background, you might have a hard time fully grasping arguments that highlight current shortcomings in the feminist movement, or arguments that position themselves as within the interests of right wing politicians, even if the motion itself does not ask teams to adopt that position or to adopt that stance, right? So obviously, I can come up here and say, you just don't be biased, like just don't have those biases. But again, as always, we have to be critical when we assess something to be true. And I think the practical application on how to do that in an actual deliberation, other than just telling yourself, you know, don't have liberal bias, don't have right wing bias, is that we need to internally walk ourselves through how we found something to be true in the same way we would walk teams through during our OA, right? And look into definites of explanation. Again, it has to be like a cause and effect relationship. Obviously, it's not always going to be like that, but more often than not, it will be this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and then that's how we arrive at the very crux of the impact or the argument that the speaker is trying to prove. And again, while it may be easy and intuitive to explain a win to a team, or to a claim to a team that made the argument that aligned with your political beliefs and your political reality, we need, as judges, we have an obligation and a responsibility to exert the same amount of effort of analysis and effort in explaining a loss to a team, or uh, an idea that we did not understand quite as well, right? um, Ways that we can explain it. Examples are insufficient proof, as in you didn't believe the claims that the overall argument relied upon. It could be because the raw facts used to explain it were just irrelevant to the overall outcome or the overall claim of the argument. Or, for example, it doesn't sufficiently prove something. And I think I will give an example for what I mean about that later. Or the argument falls into lapses in logic, therefore making the analysis insufficient for me to credit fully as an argument. Or the argument doesn't actually address the key concern or the issue or the value from the winning team, or the value that they're championing. And therefore, even if I find it to be true and analyzed, and therefore technically I can credit it as an argument, it is irrelevant to the clash that they are trying to win, irrelevant to the debate, and therefore is not going to be a claim that I will use to make them win. When evaluating claims, another way I like to look at it is, in order for me to believe X, what did the speaker at the minimum have to explain? So let's go through a sample claim and explain three possible things that needed to be proven at the minimum, and how the lack of that explanation negatively impacts the overall case if not proven. So the example's motion is, this house would ban all sports with a high likelihood of inflicting injuries, i.e., MMA, football, other contact sports. And government is proving that we should ban it because it's severely harmful to athletes. So there are three possible claims they can make. Three possible claims they can make, non-exhaustive, obviously, but probably the typical claims that you will hear from this type of side of government to this motion. Number one, Sports often do create these injuries because of the moves, the rules, the play style. This factually and structurally means most athletes are at high risk of injury. The obvious answer is that if this is not explained, then it is easy for opposition to say that this is not inherent to all sports, while they are contact sports or are inherently physical, doesn't automatically mean that someone's gonna bash their head in or someone's gonna experience a life threatening or career ending injury as a result of it, right? So it has to be explained because it demonstrates the environment that puts people, not just like a select few, but a high number of them, if not all of them, at risk of inflicting these injuries. Number two, in cases where these athletes do lead to injury, the process of first aid response and treatment is unable to fully save the athlete. So the absence of this explanation might result in opposition potentially explaining that, oh well, when they get injured anyway, because we're so used to the risky nature of contact sports, if that's even true, um then the organizers of these tournaments have already prepared first aid responders, have already prepared the necessary responses and teams that will address any cases of injury to avoid the injury from worsening in the athlete upon contact or upon the injury actually happening, right? So there, it is important for the speaker to explain that the process of first aid response and treatment is insufficient because it demonstrates that there is a continuous likelihood that the first contact of injury will lead to something that is sustaining, something that is prolonged, and something that can severely negatively impact the athlete or whoever is involved in that sport. Finally, these injuries have negative impacts to the player, i.e., career-ending injuries, which leads to loss of income for the athlete or physical and mental damage, etc. And if some government teams might even add that um, it's specifically bad that it's career ending because the nature of the way athletes train and the way professional athletes do their job is that it's literally their full-time job. Many of them sacrifice pursuing their education, sacrifice pursuing more traditional career paths in favor of participating in professional sports, and therefore a career-ending injury literally means a career-ending injury because the process to become an athlete meant that they had to trade off other options that could have served as safety nets had being an athlete not worked out for them, right? So they can add things like that. Obviously, it demonstrates that people are losing agency, people are losing economic benefit. You know, it's very risky because it's not just the risk in terms of your health, it's also the risk in terms of how much economic security you have and other things like that, right? So maybe at the bare minimum, this is what I would expect teams to explain. If they want to prove that it's harmful to them, there might be other ways that different government teams may explain it. But while there's other additional analysis that could be nice to have and would strengthen the case for sure and make it more difficult for me to believe that opposition can instantaneously rebut this claim, um, it is important to understand what at the bare minimum should they be explaining um in order for me to believe the case to be true, that is truly harmful for them to participate in, such that it's not enough that we just restrict who comes into these games, but rather that we ban it completely because this risk is inherent to every game that happens. But number two, it is important to also understand what the absence of that material means, because it's not enough for you in an oral adjudication to just say, oh, you didn't prove this, and that's that. But it's also important for you to explain that because you didn't prove this, I have to therefore believe this claim from opposition, or I am unable to believe this claim from government. For example, let's say if you don't explain point two, which explains that in cases where athletes do lead to injury, the process of first aid response and treatment is insufficient, that inclines me to believe that it is a lot riskier than you let on, and it is difficult for me to believe that it is safe and that those who get injured will actually come out of it alive or come out of that injury the same athlete they were before that injury happened, right? Because you have to explain that to the team. It's not enough that you just say you didn't do this. You have to explain why the inability to do this affects the overall image or the overall goal of the case. Second part of this lecture somehow is engagement and relevance. So I think a common question that people get is, how do you identify key issues in the debate, right? In 3v3 oriented formats. Obvious answers are issues that have the highest level of engagement, meaning more responses, or the highest level of material, meaning additional analysis, weighing, etc. But important ones also are those with that are the most contentious, meaning a continuous flow of the most valid, complete, and founded arguments relative to the other arguments and claims made in the debate. But also there is a continuous evolution in characterization, analysis, and response, such that the issue deepens at almost each exchange and continues to be undecided across the bench in terms of who wins. It's like for those who play Pokemon or any battle-based game with power-ups. When the fights are close, even when there's like a small sliver of health left in your Pokemon, they get regenerated all of a sudden with a health points potion. And apparently the exchange isn't over yet. So it's kind of like that, right? You think it's almost done because the level of destructive and responsive material is so high, but the level of constructive material is also as high as well. So we keep on going from almost done to we're so back, right? Now, in deciding key issues in the debate, you don't need to say everything, especially now that we're starting to become a lot stricter with time limits in oral adjudications, especially in majors. I think like 2 issues is fine. 2 issues is fine, assuming you talk about like 3 main things per issue. And you can always manage these expectations at the start of the OA. You can always come up and before you introduce yourself again, you can say, hello, my name is this, I'm from that. Before I start my oral adjudication, I just want to preface that due to the quality of this debate, I might not be able to cover all material and all clashes. And that is because in the interest of time, I want to distill it to the issues and contributions that I found most relevant to my call. Now, if there is a argument or a contribution that you found to be important, but you felt like was underrepresented in my oral adjudication, you're free to speak to me about that after the oral adjudication, and then I can walk you through my thought process on how I evaluated that material, right? So, same thing with panel deliberations in British parliamentary, where the time limits mean that you won't be able to cover everything, and that might affect your relationship between the people that are, grading you and giving a score. It is important for you to manage that expectation. And I guess because we're already on the topic of managing that relationship, with the speakers and the teams that are grading you, I will say this. Try your best not to be influenced by what teams will think, meaning don't be worried if not covering a certain contribution or a clash will make them mad, to the point that you feel the need to squeeze that contribution in or that clash in because you feel like if you don't, they're going to get mad. You do not work for the teams. And more importantly, you will perform better from an OA perspective and just like a judge logic perspective when you cover what you firmly believe to be important, such that justifying its presence in your OA comes naturally and with conviction, as opposed to adjusting your OA to fit what you think people want to hear, but then being unable to expound upon it in oral adjudication and in personal feedback because it doesn't actually align with your views. Now, I understand sometimes you might doubt what you think should be done, but that's the process. That's why it's important for you to become better at judging, to teach yourself to understand more complex clashes and arguments better, so that your oral adjudications will be based on your own assessment, your own opinions, your own facts, as opposed to you just trying to decide based on your fear of what the teams will think, and then just finding a way to justify it later on. Last 2 points. First, second to the last is on weighing. So there might be instances where you will try to weigh clashes or weigh contributions based on a debate that had different goals and values, and then that debate on the goals and values is where the debate lies. So, for example, on the debate about demographic winter and how countries that do experience demographic winter should be responding to it, whether it's through stuff like encouraging people within their own country to have more babies versus welcoming immigration and stuff like that. There's a fundamental difference between the values of both policies, right? It's a difference between um, protectionist, pro nationalist, pro citizen, uh, or rather pro naturally born citizen options versus one that's more globalized and more open, open borders, obviously. And so that there's an inherent debate not on the actual, not just the actual implementation, but the value and the view on what we should be doing in response to this issue. Sometimes some debates are also same goals or at least ideas of what is good or bad. And the debate is about who achieves a bigger net benefit. So in the instances of this house believes that it is in the interest of blank debate to do blank. It's a debate of do they achieve the blank in question, right? But beyond these two different types of frameworks for weighing, there are, I think, some forms of weighing or considerations that gain greater relevance depending on the motion's nuance. So examples include in actor debates, there's a difference between valuing impacts that allow the actor to achieve short-term or long-term goals, or valuing how a specific act or action done by the actor vis-a-vis the motion will affect the relationship with different stakeholders depending on how speakers illustrate that relationship to be critical to said actor. Another example is scope of impact weighing, where there's a difference between the breadth of impacts versus depth of impact. Do they explain why more people, regardless of perceived degree of harm, is a worse outcome than lesser amount of people being affected in a greater amount of harm or greater degree of harm? So, given this, you need to understand a couple of things. One, that not all impacts and analysis are made equal. So similar to what I was saying previously, not all explanations are equal. It's not just debate is not like we shouldn't be viewing it as okay, we're gonna list every response, list every argument, and then for every response to an argument, we cross it out, cross it out, cross it out. No. Um, it's like in real life when you weigh the pros and cons, right? Um, it's not a tally, it's not a shopping list of arguments, and then we're just crossing out as the debate goes by. You have to evaluate what matters to the people involved in the debate. If it's a third party actor, then what are different values that a third party actor can have? Or for the stakeholders involved in the debate, what matters to them? And how are those affected by certain actions in the debate? That's the first one. So the first one is don't assume all levels of weighing, all responses, all contributions are held equal. They will change in terms of how important or unimportant they are depending on the motion, depending on the debate. Number two, um, you need to understand what the argument is trying to prove or what debaters are implicitly saying is valuable as a result of something. So um, for example, going back to the uh motion on banning sports with high risk of injury, a gov team that will say it's career ending, it will create lifelong injury, obviously implies that the government team values long-term impacts, values the long-term sustainability of one's career as an athlete. To them, the health matters more, etc. Whereas the opposition team might argue that, these people already come in knowing that they probably will not live long lives, that their careers will not be particularly long because at any given point in time they may get that career-ending injury. It's a matter of being able to participate in that sport that they found to be their unique niche in terms of being able to gain what they want, whether it's, fame, notoriety, money, prizes, etc., which might imply that opposition instead values short-term economic gains, specifically for people who relinquish some of their long-term agency or maybe just their life in general in the long term, for being able to get assured short-term gains of money, being an athlete, etc. Right? So you have to recognize, you have to read through the lines. Sometimes they will not explicitly tell you what they value, but if you review the arguments and what they prove, it will extrapolate what is important to them. Number three, given that you're extrapolating what is important to them, it is important for you to have a view on what you think about those values. So going back to the sports example, um, what is more valuable, the long-term impact of them having career-ending injuries or allowing them to participate in the sport, etc. Right? And being able to illustrate that difference and that impact is important. Finally, in terms of packaging this assessment, so this is the last part. It's important to, number one, be considerate to teams. Even when you recognize that there may be a thrashing margin, I would encourage you to be more considerate of the team you are about to give the loss to and give them credit where credit is due. So use examples of arguments that they said, or use examples of weighing that they provided. Try your best to stay true to the wording that they said. And again, this is not to pander, but rather just to give justice to the work that they've given. And number two, again, similar to what I was saying previously on don't be on not being influenced by what other teams will think. Don't shy away from your judge values. Explain why you view that the class should be evaluated that way, and don't just walk the team through that actual evaluation process, because you and the team might have a different interpretation of how we should be evaluating the debate and what matters more than the other. And so you have to walk before you walk them through the actual evaluation process, you have to walk them through what you viewed to be important. And the way you can integrate that is, I guess, before every issue, you can integrate it just to manage expectations on when you were approaching um, judging this specific issue. What specifically were you looking for? What did you find to be the most, crucial question or sub question of the issue? Okay. So that's it. I mean, in all honesty, if you have any further questions, I guess my DMs are always open. I think there's a way for you to find my debate email anyway, so it's possible. But either way, best of luck. I hope you all have a great time judging at this year's UADC 2025. And I hope we continue to contribute to the fruitful practice that is judging.